I recently picked up 2018's God of War in preparation for Ragnarok in order to remind myself what it is I like so much about that game. I didn't have the opportunity to review God of War when it was released on the PS4, so I wanted to take this chance to look at the game a bit more critically than I did when I originally played it. God of War was credited with moving storytelling in the medium forward. The no-cut camera was hugely popular at the time of its release, but it hasn't been replicated with the same level of success since. In interviews before and following the release of the game, the team stated that they wanted Kratos' story to become more personal. Pulling the camera in closer and setting a slower pace were both effective in that regard, but the story is what really achieved Santa Monica Studios' goal. 2018's God of War presented a new version of Kratos, an older, calmer version. The story opens with the death of his second wife, Faye. The first thing you do in the game is chop down a tree to use in Faye's funeral pyre. When I realized what I was doing, I was immediately sympathetic towards Kratos. Once I realized Kratos had a son, Atreus, I couldn't help but imagine how painful his circumstances must be. Kratos' journey through the Nine Realms showcased a father that was struggling with his grief while trying to maintain a brave face in front of his son. It was easy early on to write Kratos off as a bad father, but if you look closely you'll realize Kratos is, as most parents are, just doing what he thinks is best for his child, to prepare him for what lies ahead in his life. This is what made God of War so special 4 years ago. I'm not trying to discount the combat or the visuals or the splendor of the world in which this story takes place. They're all excellent, and those are all things you've heard before. What I'm trying to say is that God of War's greatest strength is in its characters. Every aspect of them is incredible, from the voice acting to subtle changes in facial expressions that do so much to communicate what's going on in someone's head when you see them. The nuanced way Kratos and Atreus interact with each other is key to understanding why God of War was so well received. Both of them grow so much as characters on their journey, Atreus into a capable, if at times overconfident warrior, and Kratos into a more nurturing parent, having to fill the role his wife left behind. By the time I rolled the credits on God of War, I realized I had more questions than I did answers. The setup for a sequel was obvious, and some of the themes of Ragnarok were already spelled out. So when Ragnarok came, I was ready. I had finished my most recent playthrough of God of War just a handful of days prior, but even then I wasn't sure what to expect, or at least from a narrative perspective I wasn't sure what to expect. It should come as no surprise that Ragnarok is a current-gen showcase. On the PS5, Ragnarok looks amazing and runs incredibly smoothly. It's got all the bells and whistles we've come to expect from Sony's first-party offerings: variable refresh rate support, fidelity and performance modes, frame rates varying from 30 to 120 frames per second based on which mode you select, and a host of accessibility features that make the series easier than ever to get into. I'm happy those features exist, and I'm even happier that they're quickly becoming the norm rather than an exception. More people being able to play games is always a good thing after all, but I do have to wonder when we'll stop seeing major first-party games released as cross-gen titles. Make no mistake, Ragnarok might be the best-looking game on the market right now, but it's clear in some ways that it's held back by having to support the PS4. In the era of ultra-fast load times, it's apparent that supporting last-gen consoles leads to some game design choices intended to mask longer load times on older hardware. I'm talking about squeezing through narrow corridors, or unnaturally long walking segments, or standing in place before a door is allowed to be opened. These things don't occur frequently in Ragnarok, but I can't shake the feeling that they wouldn't happen at all if this wasn't a cross-gen title. Once I saw Ragnarok's title screen though, none of those things mattered. Instead, I was completely focused on picking up where God of War left off. Before I did that, I watched the recap offered on the title screen to see what someone who skipped 2018's soft reboot of the series might experience. It covered the most important elements of the story, but I couldn't help but feel that I was missing some important information here. To be fair though, cramming the entirety of God of War into a handful of minutes is an impossible task. So many of that game's greatest moments are delivered in dialogue in between quests. Those moments serve to show the changes in the relationship between the main characters. It would be impossible to condense all of that, but Santa Monica Studio did an admirable job getting new players up to speed. When it finally came time to start, I wasn't sure what to expect. All I knew was that Atreus looked much older, which meant that we weren't picking up directly where we left off, and in some ways the introduction of Ragnarok isn't all too different from that of 2018's God of War. You get a view into the current state of Kratos and Atreus' daily lives. They're still in the same humble home in Midgard, though now the entire realm is covered in snow and the Lake of the Nine is completely frozen over thanks to Fimbulwinter, which has affected all of the Nine Realms in different ways. If it sounds like I'm being cagey, it's because I still don't want to spoil 2018's God of War for you, because so much of what happens in Ragnarok is tied, especially to the final moments, of God of War. This time around, the adventure you're set on is less defined, or at least it isn't stated as clearly up front. Like I said earlier, God of War left me with more questions, and Ragnarok seeks to answer them. As a teenager, Atreus is trying to find his place in the world, and that leads him to explore the meaning of his life, who he is, and how he fits into the life that his father has crafted for them. Kratos, for his part, is adapting to Atreus' desire for independence. As a father myself, I felt like I could identify with Kratos' conflicting feelings. On one hand, every parent wants to protect their children, and on the other, we all know that someday our kids will leave the nest and become the people we've raised them to be, and you can see that at various points throughout the story that Kratos, like human parents, struggles with this. Ragnarok ends up being a journey of self-discovery for Kratos and Atreus, and it's one that I couldn't get enough of. As with any game in the series, that journey is filled with over-the-top combat against all manner of monsters, elves, and even gods. 2018's rendition of the franchise introduced slower-paced combat that I loved, and Ragnarok takes that a step further. Hits feel more impactful in Ragnarok. The Leviathan axe feels heavier and more damaging now, and the Blades of Chaos seem to hit a little lighter in contrast. Kratos also gains several new moves. Well, kind of. Some of my favorite runes have become regular parts of Kratos' arsenal, leaving room for plenty of new abilities to try out. Among those new abilities are two uses for Kratos' Rage Meter. Alongside his Spartan Fury from the previous game, Kratos gains the ability to use Valor, which heals him similarly to how an early game Talisman worked previously, and Wrath, which deals a large amount of damage in a single attack. Alongside those new Spartan Rage skills, Kratos also gains an Amulet, which he can repair throughout the course of the story, enabling him to equip up to 9 enchantments, each with its own perks and set bonuses. Enchantments are scattered throughout the 9 realms waiting for you to find them, and in some ways can be the most powerful part of your arsenal. Speaking of Kratos' arsenal, Santa Monica Studio revamped the Dad of War's skill trees this time around. The shield skill tree is gone, and Atreus' skill tree is fleshed out in its place. On top of that, each skill now has levels, meaning after you unlock it, you can improve it by using it, and once you've completed leveling up your skills, you can modify them to deal increased damage, stun, or fill up each of Kratos' weapon meters. New skill trees pale in comparison to what is arguably the biggest change God of War has seen to date, and before I discuss it, I need to mention that this is a major spoiler, but I can't discuss the game without mentioning this, so if you want to remain spoiler-free, I'd recommend skipping this section. I've marked it as a new chapter, so if you don't want to hear about this, go ahead and skip. Are you ready? Okay, let's go. You've likely already guessed it by now, but Atreus is playable for roughly half of the game. Atreus plays differently from Kratos. He's much more agile and relies on speed rather than strength to stack up damage on his opponents. Both Atreus and Kratos engage in separate questlines at various points in the game, then meet up to reconvene and push the main story forward together. I thought that this would break the no jump cuts rule established with 2018's God of War, but Santa Monica Studio managed to use some clever tricks to keep the one-shot nature of the rebooted series alive, despite handing off control between different characters in different places. In some ways, I enjoyed taking control of Atreus more than Kratos. Atreus' path towards discovering himself and his purpose, and how that generates conflict between him and his father, was captivating, though at some points I admittedly found myself hoping the duo reunites sooner rather than later. Atreus' gameplay segments are fun in their own right, but I still much prefer playing as Kratos. My favorite aspect of Ragnarok, however, is how it builds on its predecessor in every way. Mechanically, it takes a step forward, making minor adjustments to the flow and feel of combat to present an evolved version of what came before. Visually, each of the 9 realms is breathtaking, and on PS5, it's a clear step above the last-gen version. I love the fact that Kratos and Atreus aren't stripped of the abilities they gained previously, but instead build on them to become even more competent warriors. Most importantly, and specifically in Kratos' case, characters continue to evolve and deepen in unexpected ways. I loved seeing Kratos and Atreus become more complex and share more of who they are throughout their adventures. Kratos at various points throughout the game references his past in Greece, deepening the connection between 2018's soft reboot of the series and the games that came before. Hearing the events of those games told by this new version of Kratos makes me want to go back and play them despite not having enjoyed them back then. Ragnarok is ostensibly a game about gods and the unique lives they lead, but under the surface it deals with themes mere mortals are all too familiar with: grief, loss, addiction, insecurity, joy, redemption, and even love. Kratos and Atreus' trek took me places I never expected to go, and it had me guessing until its final moments. Simply put, God of War Ragnarok is my game of the year, and it isn't even close. The setting, combat, visuals, and story are nearly flawless. Throughout my 50 plus hours with the game, I never experienced anything that dampened my enjoyment. From start to finish, Ragnarok is nearly perfect, even if it's clear the PS4 is holding it back in places. I can't wait to see what Santa Monica Studio does with the new world they've built once they can build exclusively for current gen, but it's hard to argue with what we have now.